Good afternoon, everyone. A bit of context for our project. This is the second cycle of our project investigating how well learners engage with a variety of online maths resources with the aim of uncovering the reasons behind the engagement levels. We chose this topic as we have invested in technology and digital resources in maths over the past few years. However, we continue to observe that some learners are reluctant to engage with online materials, and in order to combat this, we need to better understand why this is. Alongside this primary goal, we had a series of research objectives based around flipped learning and a blended curriculum, which were also investigated during our data collection. This action research spanned a number of college closures as a result of COVID 19, and so there was a combination of blended and remote learning conducted as part of this project. This renewed focus on blended and online learning, both in and outside of the classroom, is an adjustment from the first cycle of this project, as last year we were primarily concerned with learning inside the classroom. For this project, we had approximately 100 learners and 5 teachers involved in our dataset.
Fab. So in terms of what we actually did during our project, we trialled a variety of different online maths resources. So it was things like Desmos, Corbett Maths, Edpuzzle, and things like that. So we trialled those across 3 different departments at our Printworks campus, and we collected data at different intervals in order to assess the learner and the teacher opinion towards those resources used. So this year we decided not to use an observation schedule just because of difficulties when observing remotely, when on Google Meets, because most of our learners opt to turn their cameras off. So instead, we decided to compile data using a mixture of surveys and interviews, just to ensure that both perspectives were captured. So we interviewed the teachers and the students. But it's worth noting that the teachers selected a random sample of the learners just because we didn't have the capacity to interview all 100 learners. And then our staff participants also wrote a reflection piece to substantiate our data that bit further. And as you can see in the table on the slide, there was a drop in the learner participants responding to the endpoint survey. This was because at this time, the colleges reopened and students were focusing more on preparing and sitting their mini assessments for the tag process. So yeah, we just wanted you to be mindful that we did have some decrease in participation.
Now let's look at the results. From all the data collected, we have identified the below themes to be the most significant findings. We will go through these one by one. The first one is online GCSE resources. Now, the graph from the initial survey highlights that the majority of students identified Heggerty Maths as the most commonly used online resource. And during the student interviews, they also advised that it was a resource that they engaged with the most. This finding is echoed in the teacher interviews, as you can see the figure 2, in which 4 of the 5 teachers confirmed that the resource which elicits the most learner engagement is Hecate Maths. Therefore, there was a clear consensus across the various data collection points that Heggerty Maths is the most engaged with online resource. This suggests that the most commonly used resources generally have the best engagement levels, for example, Heggerty Maths and Corbett Maths, indicating that the learners respond well to familiar resources rather than lesser used, however, no less valuable materials. Another key point to note here is that approximately 89% of the learners were overall satisfied with the resources available and with their GCSE maths classes.
So in the interviews, the learners gave a range of explanations for why they engage most with a particular maths resource. And the most common explanation for their preference was that the online resource was considered the easiest to use and the easiest to navigate. So the learners who suggested this idea of sort of easy navigation often mentioned having experience with that resource. So it was the idea that they were really familiar with it or they were just used to it. So that further backs up what Mamta was just saying about learners really responding to that familiarity. But another reason that was suggested by 5 learners who were interviewed was that the resource that they engage with most has really helpful explanations that enable their understanding. So we just put up a couple of the typical quotes up on the screen for you to see. But it was just really common for the learners to like the explanatory videos that show either the method or different methods.
Moving on to remote learning. As we mentioned earlier, our project spanned the course of lockdown periods that required entirely remote learning, but there was limited time for synchronous sessions. We therefore investigated the learners' preferences and if their engagement levels changed between live and pre-recorded content. We found that 67% of the learners interviewed preferred live sessions over pre-recorded. The main reasons for this was that they like being able to ask questions and get immediate support from their teacher. And they also felt more focused in a live session. This was also echoed by one of our teachers who suggested that learners tend to engage better during live sessions when they are instantly on hand to offer support. So we then wanted to better understand the reasons for learners not engaging with online resources and sessions despite all learning being online at that time. On screen, there are the learners' suggestions for why they or their peers might not engage with the online resources and learning. Distractions at home was the lead reason, as well as a general lack of motivation when not at college. As well as this, the teachers also identified multiple reasons for why engagement was lacking during that period. A lack of access to IT and other issues with technology or Wi Fi were thought to be the top barrier to engagement, with many learners regularly having to use their mobile phones to complete their work. Two teachers also highlighted the poor digital skills that some learners have, alongside the misconception that we treat the students by default as digital natives, which in reality is not the case. Another issue preventing engagement was a limited teacher student connection when working online, with one teacher explaining that the learners require more visual contact in order to engage. This point very well links in with our research conducted for our literature review and how the role of the teacher is essential in avoiding feelings of online isolation.
Okay, so from the research that we conducted last year, our findings was that the students generally preferred to work on paper, and that was the major reason for not engaging fully with online maths resources. And one of the main reasons for this was that they just found it easier and quicker to work out their answers on paper. However, since then, as part of this year's cycle, we've trialled new resources such as Desmos and Equagio, on which you can really easily form equations and mathematical elements and symbols. So that really improves the facility to work out online and easily type out maths answers. So although it's not necessarily a landslide majority, the fact that nearly 2/3 of the learners preferred using an online resource clearly shows that the students' perceptions towards a blended curriculum has increased during this academic year. And the main reason for preferring this is that it provides a bit of variation and it's generally thought to be a bit more enjoyable. So we've just put 2 typical quotes from that view where it's, online is more fun and people enjoy the combination for a bit of variety. So that brings us quite nicely to the first of our conclusions, which is that we've seen a significant increase in engagement and attitudes towards online maths resources as part of a blended curriculum. So this positive transition, it's quite possibly the result of the unusual context of this academic year, what with it consisting mainly of online learning. But it's important to distinguish between engagement with online resources and online learning, as the majority of our learners found it difficult to engage when working entirely online. So it can be deduced that although our learners generally struggled with motivation during remote periods, this year they are much more motivated and engaged with the blended approach, which is when they obviously use online resources as part of their wider learning. And similarly to that, we also identified a preference for online learning tasks for flipped learning, because the learners indicated that their preferred manner of preparing for their next lesson was by completing online research or watching videos on the topic. So again, while we can't necessarily comment on if this was solely due to the pandemic and the remote learning, because teachers couldn't provide paper worksheets and things like that, it nevertheless highlights that the learners actively chose to use online methods as part of their work. And the next was a clear finding throughout the course of the research was that the learners engaged best with Hegarty Maths. And that's the most widely used resource amongst all our teaching staff. And the college has championed the use of Hegarty Maths over the past 4 years. We've provided really regular training sessions so that our teachers feel confident in using it. So we therefore think it can be concluded that the learners respond well to Hegarty Maths and find it easy to use, mainly due to their ample exposure to it during their time at college and quite often at secondary school as well. So we think it's that exposure to it rather than them necessarily responding to Hegarty Maths' specific features. And finally, another possible conclusion from our research is that semantics are really important for learners. Now, not only was this an issue that we faced during the learners' confusion between terms, so they had a bit of confusion between online resources and the concept of online learning, like in the remote sense. But we could also see it in terms of the importance of names and meaning when we trialled Edpuzzle. So the resource Edpuzzle was used routinely in lessons by one of our participating teachers, but significantly, no learners mentioned it. None of them identified using it during any of our surveys. So the teacher since reflected that the learners might not have actually known the name of the resource that she was using with them. So she suggested that this was the reason that Edpuzzle was omitted in the study results. So we just thought it was interesting to consider the significance of drawing attention to the resource's name and signposting it that bit more so that learners can identify it and take notice of which resource is which.
Thanks, Jess. Following on from the conclusions, here are some recommendations for our maths teachers. Facilitate staff training on Desmos. So this is our first recommendation. Now, Desmos is an upcoming resource which we have trialed this year to set asynchronous tasks and support blended and flipped learning. It was also identified as the second most engaged online maths resource after Hegarty Maths. Despite this resource being relatively unexplored prior to lockdowns, it has already achieved some popularity in college, indicating the potential success. Further to our finding that familiarity is a major factor for engagement, to make the most of this and increase engagement with Desmos even further, we recommend staff and student training to upskill and familiarize the users. Our second recommendation is to conduct audit of experience of prior software platforms used by the learners. During the induction week, we proposed that we should ascertain which online platforms and resources students have used before and which they prefer. This will allow us to identify their baseline experience, any training needs, and trends amongst different campuses or sites. The next recommendation is around remote and blended learning provision. For those cohorts who will continue with remote learning post-pandemic, there should be an emphasis on live sessions as the learners have clearly identified this as their preference. It is also vital that senior leaders of departments ensure that devices and necessary equipment is provided to the learners, as some platforms are not compatible with mobile phones that many learners have had to use this year. The last recommendation we have got is on clarity of terminology. Teachers should draw attention to what resource is being used and why, so that students can differentiate between the different resources. For ambiguity or confusion around certain terms, teachers could use a set of predefined terms for consistency. For example, learning from home or remote rather than online learning.
Perfect. So thank you all for listening to our presentation. We really hope you enjoyed it as much as we did when we was conducting the action research. And if you are interested and you would like to read our full report, you can follow this link to our Google site, which has all the information for both of our action research projects. And Johnny Mamter and I will be here for another 5 minutes or so. So please feel free to ask us any questions that you might have. But yeah, thank you so much for listening.